In the bowels of the Imperial Palace, 10,000 kilometers beneath the Golden Throne, something far more dangerous than chaos lurks in the shadows: politics. Every day, while the Emperor's withered form burns in eternal agony above, the most powerful beings in the galaxy gather in chambers carved from Terran bedrock to decide the fate of 1,000,000 worlds. They speak in whispers that can topple civilizations and sign documents that doom entire species to extinction. Welcome to the true heart of the Imperium, where the only currency is power, and the only law is survival. The Master of the Administratum adjusted his chrono display for the third time in 10 minutes, his augmetic fingers clicking against a mahogany conference table that had witnessed more bloodshed than most battlefields. Around him, 11 other figures sat in the chamber of the High Lords, each representing a pillar of Imperial governance, each harboring ambitions that would make a Chaos Lord blush with envy. The air recyclers hummed with a mechanical rhythm that had not changed in 3 millennia, filtering the same recycled breath of tyrants and bureaucrats who had shaped human destiny since before the Great Crusade. If you crave more tales from the corridors of power, subscribe now. The Emperor protects those who understand where true authority lies. Lord Commander Militant Vasquez of the Astra Militarum sat ramrod straight, his dress uniform bearing more medals than some regiments possessed battle honors. To his left, the Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum remained perfectly still, a living statue whose very presence reminded everyone that political disagreements had a tendency to result in accidents. The Fabricator General's servo-skulls hovered like mechanical vultures, recording every word, every gesture, every micro-expression that might prove useful in future negotiations. "The Cadian Gate has fallen," announced the Master of the Administratum, his voice echoing in the chamber despite its sound dampeners. 17 subsectors have gone dark. The Departamento Munitorum reports supply lines stretched beyond all reasonable limits. He paused, allowing the weight of galactic catastrophe to settle like dust on their shoulders. "Gentlemen, ladies, we face the greatest crisis in 10,000 years, and our response will define whether the Imperium survives the next century." The Ecclesiarch leaned forward, his golden aquila catching the chamber's dim lighting. The faithful cry out for leadership. The Emperor's voice grows silent while heretics multiply like vermin. Perhaps it is time to consider— "Careful, Your Holiness." The Grand Master's voice cut through the religious rhetoric like a monomolecular blade. But it was the figure at the chamber's far end who truly commanded attention, not through words, but through deliberate silence. The Lord Inquisitor representative sat motionless, their features hidden beneath a death mask that had watched empires rise and fall. When they finally spoke, each word carried the weight of absolute authority. "Before we discuss what must be done, we must first acknowledge what has been done, and by whom." The servo-skulls stopped recording. The air recyclers seemed to hold their mechanical breath. In that perfect silence, every person in the chamber understood that the real game was about to begin. Not the management of a crumbling empire, but the far more dangerous sport of determining who would control its remains. Outside these walls, trillions of Imperial citizens went about their daily lives, unaware that their futures hung in the balance of this single conversation. They worked their shifts in manufactorums, offered their prayers in parish churches, and sent their children to die in the guard, all believing in the eternal strength of the throne. They had no idea that the Imperium's greatest weakness wasn't the tyrannid hive fleets or the expanding Eye of Terror. It was the 12 individuals who claimed to serve the Emperor while serving only themselves.
The Chamber of the High Lords operated under protocols established during the Horus Heresy, when paranoia wasn't a character flaw, but a survival necessity. Each member possessed veto power over Imperial policy, theoretically ensuring that no single faction could seize absolute control. In practice, it meant that every decision required a complex web of bargains, threats, and compromises that would have impressed a Slaneshi cultist with its Byzantine intricacies. The Fabricator General's voxgrill crackled with mechanical displeasure. The Adeptus Mechanicus has fulfilled every tithe obligation for 3 millennia. Our forge worlds burn themselves to ash, producing lass weapons and ammunition while receiving insufficient raw materials. Binary cant flickered across their visual displays like digital prayers. Perhaps it is time the Administratum explained why mining quotas have decreased 17%, while guard recruitment has increased 23%. Lord Commander Militant Vasquez straightened his already perfect posture. The Guard takes what bodies we can find, Fabricator. Dead heroes need fewer supplies than living cowards. His scarred knuckles whitened as he gripped the table edge. My regiments die holding ground that should have been reinforced by your Skitari, yet I hear whispers of Mechanicus expeditions venturing into the galactic rim. Searching for what, exactly? Knowledge, came the servo-skull augmented reply. The Omnisia's gifts are not infinite. The master of the Administratum raised a parchment-thin hand for silence. His department managed the Imperial's bureaucracy, a task that made governing 1 trillion souls seem simple by comparison. Gentlemen, the Departamento Munitorum requires specific answers to specific questions. The Officio Prefectus has filed 17,000 execution warrants for guard officers accused of hoarding ammunition. Meanwhile, the Scholastica Psychana reports that 20% of sanctioned psychers are dying during transit to combat zones, not from enemy action, but from malnutrition. The Ecclesiarch's gold investments rustled like autumn leaves. The faithful give what they can, but faith cannot replace calories. My pilgrimage fleets report entire shrine worlds consuming their own temple decorations to survive. The Emperor's light grows dim when his servants starve in his name. Perhaps, interjected the Grand Master of Officio Assassinorum, their voice carrying undertones that made veteran Astartes check their weapons' safeties. Certain individuals should examine whether their personal projects serve the Imperium or merely their own ambitions. That comment landed like a virus bomb in a crowded hab block. Every pair of eyes, augmetic and biological alike, fixed on the Grand Master's featureless mask. In the Imperium, accusations of self-interest were tantamount to charges of heresy, punishable by methods that made mere execution seem merciful. The Lord Inquisitor representative finally stirred, their death mask turning slowly to regard each High Lord in succession. Interesting. The Grand Master speaks of personal projects while maintaining 12 different safe houses within the palace district. The Fabricator General preaches resource scarcity while funding expeditions to recover archaeotech that would make certain parties extremely wealthy. The Ecclesiarch mourns starving pilgrims, while the Cardinal worlds somehow maintain full granaries. Still with us in the darkness? Hit that like button if this political maneuvering chills your soul to its very core. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. These were not empty accusations. In the labyrinthine politics of Terra, information was power, and the Inquisition possessed information on everyone. Servo-skulls hovered nervously, their mechanical spirits sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded violence. The Ordo Hereticus has compiled extensive files on resource allocation irregularities. The Ordo Hereticus continued with the methodical precision of a surgeon removing organs. Shall we review the data? The Departamental Munitorum's clerical errors that consistently benefit certain forge worlds. The guard regiments that receive equipment upgrades shortly after their commanding officers attend private dinners with Mechanicus representatives. Lord Commander Militant Vasquez's hand drifted toward his ceremonial bolt pistol, a gesture not lost on the Grand Master, whose own hands remained perfectly still on the table. You speak of corruption as though the Inquisition remains pure, yet I have reports of inquisitors requisitioning entire companies of guardsmen for classified operations that somehow result in the acquisition of rare artifacts and ancient technologies. The political chess game had evolved into something far more dangerous. Each High Lord commanded resources that could level continents, yet they sat around a table trading barbs like children arguing over ration cubes. The irony was not lost on those present. While they squabbled over influence and ancient grudges, the galaxy burned around them, and somewhere in the depths of the warp, entities older than human civilization laughed at the spectacle. The master of the Administratum cleared his throat with practiced diplomatic skill. Perhaps we should focus on immediate concerns before addressing long-term institutional reforms. The Ultramar subsector requests additional support, and the Space Marine chapters grow increasingly independent in their operations. That statement hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implications that everyone understood, but no one dared voice aloud.
The Administratum's archives stretched for kilometers beneath the Imperial Palace, a labyrinthine monument to humanity's greatest weakness: paperwork. Within these endless corridors, scribes hunched over desks that hadn't moved in centuries, processing forms that determined whether entire star systems lived or died. A single clerical error could doom a world to starvation, while a strategically placed stamp could redirect resources worth more than some sector's annual tithe. Here, in the bowels of bureaucratic power, the true rulers of the Imperium wielded their quills like chainswords. Adept Tertius Maximilian Voss had spent 43 years navigating these paper seas, his augmetic eyes scanning endless columns of figures that represented human misery on an unimaginable scale. Behind him, servo skulls darted between filing cabinets tall as cathedral spires, retrieving documents that could trace their lineage back to the Great Crusade. The soft clicking of mechanical fingers on data slates provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant hum of air recyclers struggling to process the perpetual dust of decaying parchment. "Requisition 847 Alpha Tertius," Voss muttered, his voice carrying the weary tone of a man who had processed 10,000 similar requests. "The Mordian Iron Guard requires replacement lasguns for their 23rd Regiment." He paused, stylus hovering over the approval section. The regiment in question had been deployed to the Segmentum Solar's outer rim, a death sentence disguised as a military assignment. Their survival rate wouldn't exceed 6 months, making weapon replacement a questionable investment. But the request bore the seal of Lord Commander Militant Vasquez, which meant approval regardless of logic. Voss pressed his stylus to the parchment, authorizing the expenditure of resources that could have supplied 3 hive cities for a month.
Such was the weight of political necessity in the 41st millennium. 3 floors above, senior scribe Cordelia Hecht faced a more delicate situation. The planet Verlac Prime had exceeded its population quota by 2.3 billion souls, a bureaucratic nightmare that demanded immediate resolution. Standard protocol required sterilization operations to reduce the excess population, but Verlac Prime's governor was the Lord Inquisitor's cousin. The relationship itself wasn't problematic. Nepotism had been standard imperial practice for millennia. The problem lay in how to implement necessary demographic corrections without triggering an inquisitorial investigation. Hecht's stylus hovered over 3 different forms: Sterilization Order Alpha, Standard Population Reduction, Resource Redistribution Gamma, Starvation through Supply Cuts, or the rarely used Military Conscription Theta, drafting excess population into penal legions. Each option would achieve the desired statistical outcome, but the political ramifications varied dramatically. Scribe Hecht, the voice belonged to Sub-Adept Kellyan, whose responsibilities included monitoring interdepartmental communications, a polite term for espionage. The Ecclesiarchy has filed a formal complaint regarding Verlac Prime's cathedral construction. Apparently, the planetary governor has been using sacred materials for defensive fortifications. The information struck Hecht like a bolt shell. If the Ecclesiarchy pursued heresy charges, the entire Verlac Prime situation would resolve itself through ecclesiastical purges, nicely removing both the population excess and the political complications. She reached for a different form, Ecclesiastical Investigation Request Omega, and began filling in the necessary details. Within the administratum, such moments of bureaucratic elegance were celebrated like military victories. A single form, properly filed, could accomplish what entire guard regiments might die attempting. The scribes called it administrative efficiency, though philosophers might recognize it as the banality of evil refined to an art form. The tension builds. Subscribe to witness more tales from the Dark Millennium's corridors of power. In Sector 7 of the Archives, Adept Majoris Helena Vex discovered a discrepancy that made her augmetic heart skip several beats. The tithe records for the Calixis sector showed consistent resource allocation for the past century, but cross-referencing with Departamento Munitorum requisitions revealed a concerning pattern. Certain Forge worlds were receiving materials far exceeding their documented needs, while others operated on starvation rations despite increased production quotas. The obvious explanation was corruption, Forge masters skimming resources for personal projects or black market sales. But Vex had survived 40 years in the administratum by recognizing when obvious explanations were deliberately obvious. Someone wanted these discrepancies to be discovered, which meant the real corruption lay elsewhere, hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of smaller crimes. Her servo skull chimed softly, indicating an incoming Vox message marked with the highest priority encryption. The contents were brief but chilling. Report your findings to Archive Section Omega 7. Immediately. Tell no one. The Emperor protects. The message bore the seal of the Master of the Administratum himself. Archive Section Omega 7 didn't officially exist. Vex had worked in these corridors for 40 years without encountering any reference to such a designation. Yet her access codes granted entry to a secured transport tube that carried her deep into the palace foundations, past levels she had never known existed. The chamber that awaited her contained dozens of senior scribes, each reviewing documents bearing seals from the highest levels of imperial governance. At the center of the chamber sat a figure whose identity shocked Vex more than any heretical revelation. The master of the Administratum's personal secretary, a woman who supposedly held no authority beyond scheduling appointments and filing correspondence. "Welcome, Adept Vex," the secretary said, her voice carrying an authority that made veteran Astartes sound hesitant. "You've discovered what we intended you to discover. Now we'll discuss what that discovery really means and why the official records you've spent your career maintaining are merely suggestions."
The Inquisition's fortress monastery on Terra occupied a position of deliberate irony. Built atop the ruins of an ancient cathedral, its black spires piercing the sky like accusations against heaven itself. Within its shadowed halls, 3 Odos maintained their eternal vigil. Hereticus hunting corruption within, Xenos watching threats from without, and Malleus standing guard against the horrors of the warp. Yet the greatest threat to Imperial security wasn't the enemies they hunted, it was the war they waged against each other. Inquisitor Lord Thalessa Vex of the Odo Hereticus adjusted the pict display showing surveillance footage from the chamber of the High Lords. Her augmetic eye focused on micro-expressions invisible to baseline human perception, cataloging every nervous gesture, every meaningful glance, every tell that might reveal treasonous intent. Around her, a dozen interrogators reviewed files that could damn saints or vindicate heretics, depending on political necessity. "The fabricator general's expeditions concern me," Vex stated, her voice carrying the clinical precision of someone who had ordered entire worlds purged for the greater good. 7 separate ventures into the galactic rim, each claiming to search for lost archaeotech. Yet Auspex readings suggest they're following very specific coordinates, as though hunting something particular rather than exploring randomly. Interrogator Matthias Kane consulted his data slate with practiced efficiency. The Ordo Xenos has been tracking similar expeditions. Inquisitor Lord Xerath believes they're following ancient Eldar migration patterns, possibly seeking Craftworld ruins. He paused, allowing the implications to settle. Of course, Xerath also believes the Tau Empire represents humanity's greatest existential threat, so his judgment regarding xenophilia may be compromised. The accusation hung in the air like incense smoke. Within the Inquisition, suggesting a colleague's judgment was compromised was tantamount to filing heresy charges. Vex made a mental note to investigate Kane's own loyalties. Paranoia was an occupational requirement, but excessive paranoia could indicate chaos corruption. 3 floors below, Inquisitor Lord Xerath of the Odo Xenos reviewed intelligence reports that painted a terrifying picture of galactic politics. The Tau Empire's diplomatic overtures had reached 17 Imperial worlds, offering technological advancement in exchange for cultural exchange. Worse, some planetary governors were actually considering the proposals, apparently unaware that Xenos corruption began with seemingly innocent trade agreements. "The Ethereals understand human weakness better than most humans," Xerath explained to his assembled acolytes, his bionic arm gesturing toward a holographic display showing Tau expansion vectors. "They conquer through superior psychology. They offer solutions to problems the Imperium refuses to acknowledge." Acolyte Sarah Chen, a former Schola Progenia graduate,
whose loyalty had been tested in the fires of 13 separate purge operations, raised a concern that had been troubling her for months. My lord, intelligence suggests several High Lords have been in contact with individuals who may have Xenos connections. Should we investigate? The question struck at the heart of the Inquisition's greatest dilemma. They possessed the authority to investigate anyone, including the High Lords themselves, but such investigations could destabilize the entire Imperial government. The cure might prove worse than the disease, a risk calculation that had driven stronger minds than Xerath's to madness. Prepare surveillance protocols, Xerath finally decided, but maintain absolute discretion. If the High Lords have been compromised by Xenos influence, we need irrefutable evidence before taking action. The Odo Hereticus would use any premature accusations to justify their own power grabs. His words carried bitter experience. The three Odos had spent 10,000 years at war with each other, almost as long as they'd existed. Each convinced the others had been corrupted by the very threats they claimed to fight. It was a theological certainty that chaos, corruption, Xenos influence, or heretical thinking had infiltrated the highest levels of the Inquisition itself. But identifying the specific source remained impossible when everyone suspected everyone else. Comment your theories below. What corruption stalks the halls of the Inquisition? In the deepest vaults of the fortress monastery, Inquisitor Lord Morden of the Odo Malleus faced a crisis that dwarfed the petty squabbles of his colleagues. The reports arriving from across the galaxy painted a picture of warp activity that defied conventional understanding. Demon incursions were increasing exponentially, but not randomly. They followed patterns that suggested coordination at the highest levels of the Imperium. Someone is orchestrating this, Morden stated, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The great enemy doesn't usually demonstrate such strategic coherence across multiple sectors simultaneously. His servo skull hovered nearby, its optical sensors recording every detail of the briefing for future analysis, or future evidence if Morden himself proved to be compromised. Tech Adept Varian, on loan from the Adeptus Mechanicus, processed data streams with augmetic efficiency while maintaining the emotional detachment that had kept him alive through 17 demonic incursions. The patterns suggest a single organizing intelligence, my lord, but the scope would require resources beyond any known chaos cult or rogue psycho cabal. The implication chilled Morden more than any demon he had faced in 40 years of service. If the coordination came from within Imperial space, if someone with access to the highest levels of government was orchestrating chaos incursions, then the Imperium faced an existential threat that made the Horus Heresy seem like a localized rebellion. Begin deep cover investigations of all High Lords and their immediate staff, Morden ordered, knowing the command might be the last he ever issued. If one of them serves the Dark Gods, we need to identify them before they can complete whatever ritual they're orchestrating. The three Odos had spent 10,000 years watching for external threats, while the greatest danger grew within their own ranks. Now, as the galaxy burned around them, they faced the ultimate irony. The Guardians had become the greatest threat to what they sought to protect.
The Cathedral of the Savior Emperor rose from Terra's surface like a golden mountain, its spires scratching the belly of orbital platforms while its foundations delved deep into the planet's crust. Within this monument to divine authority, the Ecclesiarchy wielded power that transcended mere politics. They commanded the souls of humanity itself. Yet, for all their spiritual supremacy, they faced enemies who understood that controlling hearts and minds required more than sermons and stained glass. Cardinal Militant Xyrion stood before the altar of eternal flame, his crimson robes flowing like spilled blood across marble floors that had been consecrated with the ashes of 10,000 martyrs. Behind him, the cathedral's vast nave stretched into shadow, filled with petitioners whose whispered prayers created a susurrus of devotion that never ceased. The sound should have comforted him. Instead, it reminded him of insects buzzing around a corpse. "Your Eminence," announced Confessor Matthias, his voice echoing off cathedral walls adorned with frescoes depicting the Emperor's victory over Horus. "The conclave awaits your presence. They grow restless." The understatement would have been amusing in different circumstances. Below, in chambers carved from the living rock of Terra itself, the most powerful ecclesiastical figures in the galaxy had gathered to address a crisis that threatened the very foundations of Imperial faith. Not heresy. They could handle heretics with fire and sword. Not alien corruption. Xenos influence withered before righteous fury. The threat they faced was far more insidious. Bureaucracy. The Chamber of Sacred Deliberation had witnessed 3,000 years of theological debate, its walls scarred by the passionate arguments of men and women who killed for their convictions. Today, those same walls observed a different kind of warfare: the slow, methodical strangulation of religious authority by administrative procedure. The Administratum has denied our requisition for cathedral repairs on 47 worlds. They claim resource allocation priorities take precedence over non-essential infrastructure maintenance. They refer to the Emperor's houses of worship as non-essential. Cardinal Militant Xyrion took his place at the chamber's head, beneath a stained glass window depicting the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne. The irony was not lost on him. They gathered in the shadow of their god's martyrdom to discuss their own potential destruction. Continue your report, Archbishop. Worse still, the Departamento Munitorium has begun recruiting from seminary worlds without ecclesiastical approval. They're drafting our novices into guard regiments, claiming emergency conscription protocols supersede religious exemptions. They're stealing our future priests to use as cannon fodder. The assembled clergy erupted in outraged murmurs that echoed like battle cries through the sacred space. For 3 millennia, the Ecclesiarchy had maintained exclusive authority over religious education and clerical recruitment. The Administratum's encroachment represented more than administrative overreach. It was theological warfare, disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. And the Inquisition? Asked Cardinal Gaust, whose responsibility for maintaining doctrinal purity had earned him a reputation that made hardened criminals confess sins they hadn't committed. Surely they recognize the heretical implications of secular interference in sacred matters. Still with us as the religious and political powers clash? Subscribe to witness how the galaxy's greatest powers tear each other apart. Confessor Matthias consulted a data slate whose contents had been encrypted with prayer ciphers dating back to the age of apostasy. The Inquisition remains divided. The Ordo Hereticus has opened investigations into 17 bishops suspected of resource misallocation, while simultaneously investigating Administratum officials for undermining Imperial faith. They're playing both sides against each other. The revelation struck the assembly like a thunderhammer blow.
the Inquisition, whose authority derived partly from ecclesiastical mandate, was manipulating religious and secular powers for their own purposes. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than mere politics. It was spiritual treachery of the highest order. Cardinal Militant Xyrion raised his hand for silence, the gesture carrying enough authority to stop conversations across the chamber. Brothers, sisters, we face enemies who understand that controlling the Imperium requires destroying its soul. They cannot defeat our faith through persecution, so they seek to strangle it with procedure. They cannot burn our cathedrals, so they let them crumble through neglect. His words carried the weight of prophecy, each syllable carefully chosen for maximum impact. The Ecclesiarchy had survived the Horus Heresy, the War of the Beast, and the Age of Apostasy itself. They would not be destroyed by filing forms or budget allocations. The time has come to remind the secular authorities why the Emperor chose us as his voice. They control supply lines and military formations, but we control something far more powerful. We control the hearts of every Imperial citizen, from Terra to the Eastern Fringe. In the cathedral shadows, hidden observers from 3 different ordos recorded every word, each organization preparing their own response to the ecclesiastical declaration of war. The administratum scribes would receive transcripts within hours, triggering countermeasures that would escalate the conflict beyond anyone's ability to control. The irony was profound. While the galaxy burned under assault from chaos, tyranids, and a dozen other existential threats, the Imperium's leadership had chosen to wage war against themselves. The Emperor's most faithful servants had become his greatest weakness. Their devotion transformed into a weapon that would destroy everything they claimed to protect. Outside the cathedral, across the sprawling hives of Terra, billions of Imperial citizens continued their daily struggles, unaware that their spiritual shepherds and temporal rulers were orchestrating their mutual destruction. They prayed to the Emperor for guidance, not knowing that his representatives were too busy fighting each other to hear their pleas.
The Sanctum Imperialis existed in a space between spaces, a chamber so classified that its location appeared on no architectural plans, its existence known only to those who wielded power from the shadows. Here, beneath layers of security that would make an Inquisition fortress seem welcoming, the true architects of Imperial policy finally revealed themselves. The room contained no thrones or ceremonial seats, only a circular table carved from a single piece of Terran granite, surrounded by figures whose identities would rewrite the history of the 41st millennium. She had no official title, claimed no formal authority, and appeared in no imperial records beyond the most mundane administrative entries. Yet when she spoke, the galaxy trembled. The woman, known only as the Secretary, had served 17 different masters of the administratum, had witnessed the rise and fall of 6 Lord Commanders, and had outlived 3 separate Grand Masters of the Officio Assassinorum. Her longevity alone suggested augmetic enhancement, but her true power lay in something far more valuable than extended life: institutional memory. Gentlemen, ladies, the performance continues to exceed expectations, she announced to the assembled figures, her voice carrying the casual authority of someone who had orchestrated the deaths of billions. Around the table sat individuals whose public roles masked their true functions: a senior scribe who controlled resource allocation across 17 sectors, a mid-level inquisitor whose real job was managing information flows,
a cardinal whose sermons shaped imperial policy more than any official decree. The man seated to her left bore the unremarkable appearance of a junior tech adept, complete with standard-issue augmetics and the submissive posture expected of his rank. In reality, he was Magus Dominus Vex, whose authority within the Adeptus Mechanicus exceeded that of the Fabricator General himself. His servo-skulls had infiltrated every major forge world, his data network stretched across the galaxy, and his understanding of Imperial infrastructure made him indispensable to anyone seeking real power. The Ecclesiarchy's declaration has triggered the expected responses, Vex reported, his vox grill crackling with mechanical precision. The Administratum is implementing Protocol Theta 7, which will reduce ecclesiastical funding by 37% over the next fiscal cycle. The Inquisition has activated surveillance networks targeting religious leadership. The High Lords believe they're managing a crisis. They have no idea they're performing a script we wrote decades ago. Across the table, a figure whose public identity was that of a lowly archive clerk removed her unremarkable mask to reveal features that would have shocked the Imperium's enemies more than its allies. Lady Militant Cordelia Vex, sister to the Inquisitor, cousin to the Tech Adept, and mastermind behind a conspiracy that spanned centuries of Imperial history. Her family had infiltrated every major institution of governance, placing members in positions of apparent insignificance while accumulating actual authority. The beauty of our approach, she explained, consulting data slates that contained the real Imperial budget, not the fiction presented to the High Lords, but the true accounting of galactic resources, lies in its sustainability. Previous attempts to control the Imperium relied on seizing formal power, which inevitably led to civil war and systemic collapse. We've learned from those mistakes. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than replace the High Lords, they had made them irrelevant. Rather than eliminate the existing power structures, they had created parallel systems that actually governed while the official institutions performed elaborate theater for public consumption. The High Lords issued proclamations and signed documents, believing themselves to be the masters of humanity's fate, never realizing that their decisions had been predetermined by subordinates they barely acknowledged. Phase 3 begins immediately, the Secretary announced, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. The Fabricator General's expeditions will discover archaeotech that we've already prepared for them to find. The Inquisition will uncover heretical plots that we have carefully constructed to eliminate our remaining opposition. The Ecclesiarchy will rally the faithful against bureaucratic oppression, never suspecting that we control both the oppressors and the liberation. The gentleman seated at the table's far end finally spoke. His voice carried accents that hadn't been heard on Terra for 10,000 years. He wore the simple robes of a palace custodian, a role that granted him access to every secure facility while remaining beneath notice. His true identity would have shattered the foundations of Imperial faith. He was one of the original Terran nobility who had supported the Emperor during the Unification Wars, sustained through technologies that predated the Dark Age of technology itself. The Emperor's vision was always larger than his contemporaries understood. He saw that humanity's greatest enemy wasn't chaos or alien invasion, but its own tendency towards self-destruction through political incompetence. The Imperium he created was never meant to be governed by the High Lords.
It was designed to be governed by those wise enough to remain hidden. The revelation recontextualized everything: the constant political infighting, the bureaucratic inefficiency, the religious fanaticism. All of it had been deliberately cultivated to create a system where real power could operate without interference from those too ambitious or too stupid to be trusted with genuine authority. "The galaxy burns while we consolidate control," observed another figure, her voice carrying notes of genuine concern. "Perhaps it's time to consider whether our methods serve the greater good or merely our own interests." The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implications that everyone understood, but no one dared voice out loud. They had saved the Imperium from itself by subverting its democracy, protected humanity by manipulating its leaders, and preserved the Emperor's vision by betraying his explicit commands. The greatest patriots in human history had become its most successful traitors.
The secretary smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose life's work was finally reaching completion. Tomorrow, the High Lords will receive intelligence suggesting that the others have been compromised by outside forces. They'll turn on each other with predictable fury, eliminating the few individuals who might have discovered our influence. When the dust settles, we'll emerge from the shadows to restore order, reluctant saviors accepting the burden of leadership for the greater good. Outside this hidden chamber, across the sprawling complexity of the Imperial Palace, the official government of humanity continued its elaborate performance. High Lords schemed against each other. Inquisitors investigated threats that existed only in their imaginations, and bureaucrats processed forms that had been predetermined to produce specific outcomes. They believed themselves to be the masters of human destiny, never suspecting that they were merely actors in a play whose script had been written by their supposed subordinates. In the deepest foundations of the Imperial Palace, where the weight of 10,000 years presses down like the judgment of history itself, the truth finally stands revealed in all its terrible glory. The Imperium of Man, that vast, sprawling monument to human ambition and divine will, has never been what its citizens believed it to be. The High Lords of Terra, those titans who stride across the galaxy making pronouncements that shape the fate of billions, are nothing more than elaborate puppets dancing to strings pulled by hands they never see. The Secretary and her confederates have achieved something that the Horus heresy could not. They have conquered the Imperium from within, not through the crude application of military force or the corruption of chaos, but through the far more insidious weapon of bureaucratic manipulation. They understood what Horus never grasped, that true power doesn't flow from the barrel of a bolter or the edge of a chainsword, but from the ability to control information, resources, and the very systems that keep a galactic civilization functioning. For 10 millennia, while the galaxy burned under assault from every conceivable enemy, the real rulers of humanity have operated in perfect anonymity. They've guided the Imperium through its darkest hours, not with grand gestures or heroic sacrifices, but with subtle adjustments to supply lines, strategic placement of personnel, and the careful cultivation of conflicts that eliminate threats to their authority. Every crisis has strengthened their position, every victory has advanced their agenda, and every defeat has removed potential rivals from the board. The irony cuts deeper than any monomolecular blade. The Emperor,
whose vision of human unity and rational governance was corrupted by the very institutions he created to protect it, would find his Imperium unrecognizable. The religious fanaticism of the Ecclesiastica, the paranoid brutality of the Inquisition, the bureaucratic nightmares of the Administratum, all of it exists not despite the shadow government's influence, but because of it. They've nurtured humanity's worst impulses while claiming to serve its highest ideals. But perhaps most terrifying of all is the possibility that they're right. The High Lords, left to their own devices, had shown themselves capable of such spectacular incompetence that the Imperium's collapse seemed inevitable. The Ecclesiastica's religious extremism, the Mechanicus's technological hoarding, the Guard's casual disregard for human life, all of these institutional failures might indeed require the guidance of those wise enough to remain hidden, patient enough to work across centuries, and ruthless enough to sacrifice individual freedom for collective survival. The Shadow Rulers have preserved the Imperium by destroying everything it claimed to represent. They've saved humanity by enslaving it, protected its future by betraying its past, and honored the Emperor's memory by perverting every command. They are the greatest patriots and the most successful traitors in human history. Simultaneously, the Imperium's salvation and its damnation. As the official government continues its elaborate theater above, and as trillions of Imperial citizens go about their daily lives below, the true architects of human destiny work in darkness, their names unknown, their faces unseen, their authority absolute. They've solved the riddle of galactic governance by recognizing that the price of order is freedom, the cost of survival is truth, and the weight of responsibility is too great for those who seek it. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no democracy, no transparency, no accountability, only the eternal dance between those who believe they rule and those who actually do. The Emperor may sit on the golden throne in eternal torment, but his true successors have never worn crowns or borne titles. They've ruled from the shadows for 10,000 years, and will continue to do so until the last star burns out or the last human draws breath. The puppet masters have revealed themselves not to grant democracy or restore justice, but to demonstrate that both were illusions from the very beginning. In the Imperium of Man, power belongs to those wise enough never to claim it publicly, patient enough to work across millennia, and ruthless enough to sacrifice everything, including truth itself, on the altar of survival.